Welcome to the seventh presentation on aesthetics. This one is specifically on the material aesthetics, and its undertitle would be Physicality and Process. We will be looking in this final aesthetics in the use of clay as a material and glazes as a material, where the physicality of the material is central to the aesthetic and the process of transformation as well. The four elements composing ceramics are air, fire, water, and earth. Here is an example of that in the work of Candler from mid-18th century Germany, and four more examples here made in the following century, which are maybe much less successful, one could say. It's a question of taste. But the earliest pot we have in the history of humankind is from Yunnan, China, and it dates from about 12,000 years ago. So the history of ceramics starts with figuration, as we will see later on, about 25 to 30,000 years ago. Then the first pot, hand-built pot, about 12,000 years ago in China, and not long after that in Japan. The invention of the wheel around 8,000 years ago creates a revolution, and this revolution continues all the way to today. This is the cave where such a pot was discovered in China, and an example of a fragment of a pot. Those pots were discovered in fragments with many pieces missing, but they could be reconstructed, and from a fragment we know the shape of the pot, how it was built, we can understand its function, and all kinds of information can be gotten even from fragments, as again we will see later on. And this is what I mean when I talked about the archival nature of ceramics and the fact that ceramics is the memory of humankind. What's so interesting about the material aesthetics is all the other aesthetics we have seen so far. The classical aesthetics about form, the flux aesthetics about the effects of glazes in ceramics, the decorative aesthetics about decoration more specifically, and then the narrative about storytelling and surface informed by framing. The simulation aesthetics, which is when ceramics looks like other material, and then the industrial aesthetic that we saw last time. All of those aesthetics appear all over the history of ceramic, all over the world. They are more or less universal and intemporal, while the material aesthetic itself is specific to Japan in its origin. It doesn't really exist very much before it is found in Japan, and from Japan it had a tremendous influence on the development of contemporary ceramics more specifically, and we'll look into that somewhat as well. So this is an example of two beautiful and extraordinary vessels from Yomon, Japan, which is the Neolithic period of Japan, very old objects, thousands of years old. And you can see here that the physicality of the material and the process of transforming it are central to the experience they offer. Another example from Yomon on the left, and even the one on the right is a very old Yomon pot that was repurposed in the 16th century in the Momoyama period by putting gold on the interior and making it into a jar for the tea ceremony. So you can see here examples of iga ware, water pots and flower vases, again from 16th century Japan, where the cracked, bloated, and deformed wares may be refired multiple times with cracks refilled to seal them, so the ware retains function for the tea ceremony. So this approach to materiality and to extreme process by firing the ware so that it breaks and distorts and cracks, and then those are repaired in multiple firings and so on and so forth. This is what I'm talking about the specificity of the material aesthetics in Japan and its origin in Japan, basically in the 16th century, although it goes back all the way to prehistoric time in the Yomon period, and will have a tremendous influence. So those kinds of objects are quite difficult, because they look crude and badly made and very raw. But all of those qualities were highly praised in Japan at the time, basically through the development of the tea ceremony also at that time, and we'll talk about that very soon. This is Bizen ware made in the village of Bizen. It is unglazed and it is ash deposits in the long wood firing that creates the final surface on the ware. So Bizen ware is one of those material aesthetic ware made in Japan at the time, and those kinds of ware are still made today in Japan for the needs of the tea ceremony, and they've had a tremendous influence on the development of contemporary ceramics, as I have mentioned earlier, and will demonstrate a bit later. So those are two Bizen plates made for the tea ceremony, which we call sha no yu. And on the right, this one has traces of straw soak in salt. So by soaking the straw in salt and depositing it on the unglazed ware before firing, you obtain this beautiful effect. So again, an approach to materiality and process that's specific to this aesthetic. This is an example of a tea house for the tea ceremony. The tea ceremony is a very complex, more or less spiritual event that takes place in specific buildings called tea houses. And some of you may want to look deeper into it and research it further. There are all kinds of aspects to the tea ceremony aesthetic, and what we call wabi-sabi can be defined according to those three principles. And those of you who are more interested in that aspect can freeze this frame and read it carefully and research it further as well. So one type of work made for the tea ceremony, mostly for the making of tea bowl, is raku ware. And the first raku was Shojiro, working 1516, 1589. This is a black raku bowl from 1575. And like the tea ceremony, raku has a long and deep history. It's rather complex. And I will just introduce it to you here through this presentation and further on in the reading that you have to do for next week. But let me just say that there is black raku and red raku in Japanese raku ware. And then there is a long genealogy of makers, Onami Koetsu being one of them, and this is one of his tea bowl. A tea bowl is called a shawan in Japanese tea ceremony. And this one, as you can see, was heavily cracked and repaired with gold lacquer. So Koetsu was a very interesting maker as well. You can see on this tea bowl that the trace of his fingers left on the wall of the vase, and by pressing the clay between his finger, it cracked the edge of that tea bowl. And those flaws are perceived by the Japanese tea master as an aesthetic improvement on the experience of the work. Other examples of Koetsu tea bowls and followers like Doniu with the black raku ware from around the 16th century as well, Iniyu and Shojiro in the 16th century and 19th century, Tanyu, and so on and so forth. So raku has a very interesting history, and it's quite complex. Red and gray chino are something we have looked at as well previously in the glaze aesthetic mostly. And here are two examples of that. So this is glazed ware that behaves according to application and the composition of the glaze and its firing in various ways, but always creates surfaces of great richness in terms of texture and variety, and sometimes flaws embedded into the aesthetic of the work. Another very interesting phenomenon around tea ceremony and tea ware and tea bowls is that the tea masters will go to peasant communities, and quite often in Korea, and look at thousands of bowls produced by the potters for their daily needs, and they would pick one that was special, that had specific qualities that appealed to them, that embodied sort of the essence of simplicity that they were trying to grasp and contain within teaware, and they would bring those very simple, very cheap, made anonymously by peasants bowls to Japan, where they would become highly praised and prized and are now considered national treasures in Japan. So I'm showing you some examples of national treasures brought to Japan from Korea for the need of the tea ceremony. If one such bowl came onto the marketplace today, which is impossible because they are in very prestigious museum in Japan, they would sell for prices achieved by the great master paintings in European art. Another interesting characteristic aspects which I've brought up a bit earlier is kintsugi repairs, where if an object breaks or cracks, it is repaired with gold lacquer, and it is considered that those repairs constitute improvement on the beauty of the object. Those are very interesting examples here where we have objects that have been repaired with fragments from other objects. So instead of repairing the objects with the missing fragments that came off, fragments from other pieces were introduced into the final reconstruction of the thing, which is quite an interesting approach to an extreme form of reclamation. Onisaburo Degoshi was a tea master and an important religious leader in Japan during those dates, and those are two examples of his work in raku as well. And raku, as I said, a long genealogy. This is the work of Raku Kijizaemon 15, who is the 15th Grandmaster of the raku line, and he makes his raku today in contemporary Japan. Raku is also interesting because it became a phenomenon in the United States that then transferred all over the world through the discovery by Paul Zollner of post-firing reduction, or what we could call American raku. So those are two examples of Paul Zollner's work. And by introducing the reduction of combustible material after the firing of the ware, very exciting surfaces can be achieved, and those are two examples of that. In Canada and in BC specifically, Walter Dexter was the great master of raku in the last decades. So let's move on to other material aesthetic cultures. The culture of Korea, which we have mentioned a bit earlier in relations with teaware. And in Korea, we have a specific form that's very praised, and it is the moon jar, which is basically composed of two bowls joined together at the rim to create those very elegant but a little bit distorted shapes that are quite specific to the quality of form that we find in Korea. And this is the work of Yi Kyum Kim from Korea. She is a contemporary potter working today who makes quite exquisite work, in my opinion, of great simplicity, but where the materiality and the process are central to the work. Other Japanese traditions and their influences. So as I've mentioned earlier, Japan is at the origin of the material aesthetic, and it is from Japan that it has traveled all over the world, created tremendous transformation of ceramic history and ceramic culture. And those are examples of other wares. We've already mentioned raku and bizen. This is karatsu ware that are very characteristic with the mixture of a white and a dark glaze. Oribe ware, which have been mentioned before as well in those presentations. They may appear to be naive and childish, but actually they are of great refinement and sophistication. And again, among my favorite wares made in the history of ceramic because of those specific qualities. Oribe ware were also produced in China for the Japanese market. And here you have an example of that cultural exchange between the two countries. And a lot of ware made for the tea ceremony and for the Japanese market were actually produced in China. and they are made in China following the sensibility of the Japanese market. And I find this, again, relationship between the two countries, the two aesthetics and so on, to be quite amazing. Another type of Chinese ware that was highly praised in the Japanese market is what we call koso metsuke, which means old and worm-eaten. And because of the way the ware were made, the glaze would crawl at the edges and create defects in that part of the work. Now, in China, this would not be acceptable, certainly not for the imperial court, where everything had to be absolutely perfect with no flaws of any kind whatsoever. But for the Japanese, flaws are seen as a positive thing, as something that enhances the quality of the work and makes it even more beautiful and make its experience more extreme and exciting. So those types of ware were made in China for the Japanese market, where they were very highly prized. Shigaraki ware is also another type of ware made in the village of Shigaraki, where unglazed stoneware are fired in wood-fired kiln that creates this distinctive surface. Another characteristic of Shigaraki ware is the presence of small grains of feldspar in the clay that makes all those white spots that one sees over that surface. Muromashi ware is another type. There are literally dozens and dozens of them. I'm just introduce you to the more famous, the more known, the more basic, like Tamba ware. Working in the 20th century, Kyotaji Rosanjin revived a lot of the old traditions and old styles of pottery making, and by that revival, he was extremely influential as well. Another 20th century Japanese potter is Kanjiro Kawai. Two examples of his work here. And Soji Hamada, who was a friend of Bernard Leach and helped bring the aesthetic of Japan into folk pottery making in the European world that then again traveled to other parts of the world. So those are examples of the work of Bernard Leach, influenced by the aesthetic of pottery making in China, in Korea, and in Japan, and creating a synthesis of those sensibilities from a European position in his very influential work. His influence was worldwide. This is an example of one of his students, Warren Mackenzie, and another one that returned to Australia, Gwen Anson Piggott, and made this quite exquisite work as well. Now, in the 20th century, there are modernist precursors as well to the development of what I call the material aesthetic in 20th century ceramics, and this is a brief introduction. First of all, there would be Quentin Bell and Roger Fry working at the Omega workshops in Bloomsbury, London. And this is work from the 1920s, where there is a freshness, a spontaneity, an unpretentiousness at the level of form, and things don't have to be perfect. And this was in reactions to the industrial aesthetic, where perfection was so central to the experience of the work. In Italy, in the 1930s and 40s, we have Leoncillo Leonardi, who made work of great physical presence and transformed by process in very exciting way, where the materiality and physicality of the form is very exciting. And this was extremely influential on somebody like Peter Volkos, working in the United States starting in the 1950s. And then he was also very influenced by one of his predecessor and contemporary, Lucio Fontana, also working in Italy and addressing the transformation of the material through a powerful gesture and almost a violent approach to mark making. Those are examples of the work of Lucio Fontana. As you can see, a denial of function, a deconstruction of the form, and a very raw and crude approach to making, by a lot of physicality of touching and smearing and so on and so forth. And this is an image of Lucio Fontana seating on one of his large-scale sculptural ceramic work. And this type of work, coming from Italy, who was looking at Japan and at absorbing all of those global influences, were tremendously influenced in the development of the material aesthetic, first in the United States. And you have an example here in the very early work of Jackson Pollock. He did a bit of ceramics at the very beginning of his career when he was an art student, and those are two examples of it. In Dutch culture, the work of Anger Jorn from the Cobra movement, also from the 50s, shows you how those influences are absorbed and translated into other types of sculptural gestures. In Japan itself, there was a renewal and a revival of that aesthetic through the work of the Sodeisha group, and Kazuo Yagi was one of its leaders. So those people moving away from functionality and making highly sculptural work of great physical presence, where the process of making is central to the experience, again, were tremendously challenged by the traditional people and created a new movement of great influence. People who were aware of all of those developments, including Bernard Leach, the development of are Henry Moore, the celebrated sculptor, or Isamu Noguchi, the Japanese-American sculptor as well. Two more examples of the work of Noguchi. So all of those things came together more or less when Peter Volkos started to make this work in California in the 1950s, and all the way to his death at the very end of the 20th century, I believe. And Peter Volkos, through his teaching and through the making of his work, extremely large scale, very sort of macho handling of the material, and deformation and deconstruction and reassembly and so on and so forth, was very influential. Another aspect of the influence of Japan on the development of European and contemporary ceramics is what we call Japonism. And Japonism was very popular in Europe when a lot of exchange happened after the reopening of Japan to global trade, basically, and a lot of ware came to Europe and prints and so on and so forth. This had an influence on decorative arts, on painting. People like Van Gogh was greatly influenced by Japonism. And here you have two potters, Auguste de la Herche, Émile Decoeur, who make work very much influenced by what had happened in Japan before and at the same time as they were making those ware. So there was a lot of cultural exchange through an opening up of the globe at the time. And those type of ware, which would have been unthinkable in Europe before, became very popular. And France was at the center of this movement, and then it traveled all over Europe as well, and went in a variety of countries, and many people took it on. And this approach of a very sort of fluid making, improvisational organizations of shape, a thick application of glazes, the introductions of flaws and mistakes, and kiln problems as part of the aesthetic of the work. All of those things come from Japan. And an artist like Paul Gauguin, who did a fair bit of ceramics in the 1880s, also helped in opening up the European sensibility to the Asian sensibility coming from the extreme versions of ceramic making we find in Japan prior to that time. And in the United States, the extraordinary work of George Orr, working in the late 19th and very early 20th century, making work at the time of Cubism, if not before, and working with the deconstruction of space and making you aware of the working of an object and how it's experienced, the way Cubism does something similar in painting. And one could argue reasonably convincingly that George Orr was a precursor to those developments in visual arts. The work of George Orr is really extraordinary for all of those reasons. He may have been aware of some aspects of Japanese ceramics, but the way he deconstructs space, collapses the volume, creates radically new experience in his work. And the work of George Orr was not very prized during his life. He was perceived as a weirdo and a bit of a crazy guy. They called him the Mad Potter. And his work was forgotten, and it's only in the mid-1970s that it was rediscovered. And it's only from that time that he started to have a tremendous influence on ceramics since then. And he has an amazing formal inventiveness and a total freedom with familiar forms, which is quite extraordinary in terms of the impact it had when people rediscovered that type of ware, and ceramic sort of shifted again from the mid-1970s and became what it is today. So this is a picture of George Orr with one of his wonderful marble clay collapse vessel. George Orr was a showman. He would sell his ware by selling photographs of himself in all kinds of positions. So he was one of the first multidisciplinary artists as well, incorporating performance, photography, media in the making of his work and its marketing. A few more images of this amazing man who did really extraordinary work and never really gotten the credit he deserved during his lifetime, and now is considered one of the great master, not only of American ceramics but world ceramics. And I've always liked those works of Marc-Louis Solon, who are not really part of the material aesthetics because the materiality and the process are not really central in terms of the rawness of it. But at the same time, the material used and how those materials are used are very much connected through their singularity and their oddness to the aesthetic as well. Let's talk a little bit more about glazes. We've looked at glazes during the flux aesthetics presentation, but in that aesthetics we can again revive this approach to glazing through excess and extreme form of making, of which salt glazed stoneware could be a type, and also eosin or iridescent glazes made at Jolny in Hungary and in other parts as well. The work of Thomas Besançon, who was an American monk who developed wonderful glazes, new colors, new applications, new surface texture in his work in a monastery. Jacques Sicard working at Weller Pottery with, again, luster glazes. So this is, again, to refresh your memory that glazes can be part of the material aesthetics to the approach to extreme and excess and surface of great richness, and where the application and the firing of the ware, because lusterware have to be fired in a very specific way to achieve those amazing results. Crystalline glazes, which are specific to certain material, the way the ware is applied, the way the ware is firing, all create the final effect, and in that sense connect that type of ware to the material aesthetic. And this is an example from an artist from Holland. And lava glazes were very popular in the 1960s, and all kinds of industrial ware were made with this extreme applications of very thick glaze that would bubble up and create craters and very exciting surface. Something that Lucy Rie, the celebrated English potter, and Gertrude and Otto Nazler, coming from Austria, I believe, and then working in California in the 50s and 60s, is emblematic of. Another aspect of the material aesthetic I want to bring up is marbled and colored clay. Again, this has a long history in the field. You have Wilton ware on the left and a teapot from Staffordshire on the right. An example from Josiah Wedgwood. We've looked at those types of ware in the simulation aesthetic, but again, because of the approach to materiality and process so specific of the material aesthetic, I wanted to introduce them as well in this presentation, and a few contemporary example or quite recent example in the work of Les Manning, combining various stoneware, earthenware, and porcelain to create those landscapes, as well as the work of Lucy Ree, again from England, combining both marble clay and crater glazes on this wonderful bottle form. Marble clays are quite common and specific to the development of ceramics in Japan, and this is an example from Japan on the left and from a Japanese American artist on the right. And we find example of marble clay in the work of Ewan Anderson in the UK, Babs Ainen in Holland, Margie Yuto in the United States again, and all those artists use the extraordinary quality of textures and color embedded in marble clay to create exciting new work, exciting new visual experience, where the transformation of the material by extreme and excessive process creates the final object. Wood firing is also part of the material aesthetic in a big way. I've brought that up with earlier example. I will show again some contemporary makers who use wood firings in many exciting ways. In Australia, in Japan, in the United States, Paul Chalef or Rob Barnard are proponents of that aesthetics. John Balistreri and Ted Adler are younger makers working in the continuous development of that type of forms and that type of artistic experience in their work. Jack Troy is one of the great masters of wood firing working in the United States. In Canada, we have Robert Archambault working near Winnipeg, Manitoba. In Quebec, Louise Doucet and Saitoshi Saito, an husband and wife team, working since the early 60s in ceramic making. In Norway, Thorbjørn Slasbo, and many, many, many more worldwide. So before we complete this presentation on the material aesthetics, I want to bring out another category which is related to it in terms of its opposition to extreme materiality and extreme process of making. And this is what I would call conceptual ceramics. And it's interesting to introduce it here in opposition at all the other material I've presented to you so far. And you have that kind of approach, as I've shown before, in the work of Bernard Palissy with reversal of color, an example you may remember from a previous presentation, and also color reversal in the work of Nonomura Ninsei, the teacher of Ogata Kenzan, the great decorator. And here you have color reversal where the moon is black and the night sky is white. And those kinds of reversal are characteristic of ceramic aesthetics of all kinds, and I bring and analyze this issue in many of the readings I've assigned for this class. You have example of that here in the work of Pablo Picasso, an example of a conceptual approach to making where void and absence is part of the making of the form, where a vase is cut out on the side of a pitcher and its absence makes you aware of its presence. And again, in the void between a bottle and the handle, the head of a character is drawn and represented. We have example of that approach to absence and emptiness in Jaina ware from India, and also in the case of Leopold Fulham from Montreal, where the outline of a teapot has been cut out of a slab so that the teapot is not there. But when we look at this image, I guess, what we see is a teapot nonetheless, despite the fact that there are no teapots. Two examples of Chinese doors in the shape of vessels, where the absence and the void represents something tangible that we may recognize. We have this phenomenon in the work of Greg Pace, where the empty space between two large vessels creates the silhouette of a naked man. And I will complete these presentations with a few examples of my own work, where a set of dishes is used to represent the making of ceramic and its presentation and its experience. So when you put the saucer down, you also see the image of a saucer represented on the object. When you add a plate to the stack, you also had the image of the plate to the representation. And then when you add the cup to the ensemble of three objects, you add the image of the cup in the position it occupies in the stack to finalize the installation of the work. And then the very last image for today is the most expensive cup in the world that you can go to a store and buy for that kind of money today. So this is another form of excess and extreme, and which is interesting to consider in the material aesthetic chapter. So we are done today with this last image with the aesthetics. Next week we will be starting on the theme, and the first one will be food. I look forward to have you there next time, and see you next week.